Well, good morning, James.
Hey, Matt.
Man, we're back on the podcast circuit.
2023, we have snow in Colorado, and we're back together, buddy.
Yes, it is. Yeah, today we are going through an unexpected snow day, storm of the century. We were supposed to wake up, I think, with 12 inches, and I think I have 3. How about you?
I think we're about 5 or 6, yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. So, which is kind of odd since we're only, 4.5 miles apart from each other. Yeah. So, you got any big plans for this snow day?
You know what? I have 2 books that I ordered that I really need to read to figure out how to do my job, and so I'm gonna be reading those this afternoon.
That's awesome.
Or at least starting.
Yes, that's cool. Yeah, my family and I, we got tickets to the stock show tonight, the Denver Western
Sweet.
Stock Show. So we're gonna go head down there and participate in the rodeo. It's why I'm wearing my flannel today. I want to, blend in.
You're looking
good,
man.
I'm just missing your belt. I just need a big belt buckle.
Yes.
So I
And
told
of
Sarah.
course,
I told Sarah today that I was going to go down there and buy some boots, and she said, "Why would you just waste your money? You would never wear them."
and of course, after it, Mercy's gonna quit asking for a dog, and she's gonna want something a lot bigger.
And probably a bull. Yeah. Dad, can we have a bull that we can ride in our backyard?
And then, Dad, when he gets old, we can eat him.
It's a win-win. Win-win. So, well, as we get back into our podcasting, this is we're kind of hitting the reset button and starting fresh with some new content and direction of where we want to go. And so maybe just take a moment, because we've had a lot of conversation, you and I, about what we want this podcast to look like and how we're going to use it. And so maybe just take a moment to explain to everybody who's listening what that looks like.
I love that. Yeah. So really our desire and my desire in participating with you in this is for us to talk about that place where spiritual reality and real life merge. And especially as pastors, a lot of times we do that in preaching and in other public ways like that. But in some ways, this is a super casual way for you and I to open up our hearts and our minds a little bit and wade in with people. So our dream in this would be that men and women would be driving home from work or on a run or in the gym, and they'd be able to listen to a spiritual conversation that resonates with what's going on in their real life, and hear a little bit of how we think about it, but that would spur them on to think and pray about, how do I think about this? And how does faith intersect whatever the subject is? And we have great freedom now that we can kind of talk about anything we want.
That's exactly it. And, one of the exciting things for both you and I is that we'll probably get to hit some topics that we typically wouldn't maybe on a Sunday morning in our preaching. And there's probably no bigger conversation happening right now than really the first topic that we've picked, which is around this word called deconstruction. And it seems like, there's podcasts out there, there's articles and blogs, you can read tons of them out there about people who are deconstructing their faith. And what that means, what that falls out, we want to talk about today. And what's fascinating is I just read an article yesterday, I believe Barna put it out, but for the last probably 2 decades, over 50% of people have read their Bible at least 3 times a week. After COVID, and nobody knows why, but Bible reading is less than 35% of Americans now. And in this conversation of deconstruction of faith and what does all that look like and where do we search for answers, so on and so forth, it was just fascinating to see that very recent study that was just put out, as everybody seems to be wrestling with deconstruction and deconstruction of the faith. And so when it comes to deconstructionism, you and I, doing our research and looking this up, really that coin was termed with a French philosopher. And the idea behind it was, the word was being aware of all the possible ways that authors contradict their own premise. That was the original thing. And then we as Americans kind of took it up a bit. And when it comes to deconstruction, just generally, academically speaking, it's really questioning and interrogating everything within culture. And so you no longer go to be, in English or read literature because you enjoy it, but you interrogate it for, these issues of racism or, of patriarchy in society or, LGBTQ issues or whatever it is, but you're interrogating the text, really trying to tear it down to a place of, I guess, whether to believe it or not.
Yeah, and my kids are in college, and yours are in elementary and high school, right, and middle
Yep.
school, and the reality is that our kids are just being exposed to this this idea of deconstructionism is why we approach literature. So rather than the content of it or the grammatical structure or the voice or the moral lessons, it's being evaluated from a different vantage point, which oftentimes misses the purpose. I mean, a great example of it is one of the books on the no list is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. Right,
Yeah.
great book. All of us read it. Fantastic, like the moral character of Atticus Finch, Scout's youthful, like she doesn't understand racism and she doesn't understand what's going on in her town.
Yeah.
But the specific fact that it deals with racism is why that book is on the no read list, and yet our kids are missing out on a fantastic character in Atticus and understanding that kids wrestle, and that's part of being a youth is
Yeah.
the world's more complex, right? So in deconstructionism, we're missing something fantastic for our kids and our culture that helped us develop.
Yeah, and there's, we were talking about other books that are probably soon to be on this, right? Like The Diary of Anne Frank, again, a book that we all read that helped us kind of understand World War II and what it was like from a Jewish perspective, and the deconstruction that's happening within that book to, Schindler's List, and
Yeah.
and again dealing with some of the ramifications of racism and genocide and all the rest, and because of the interrogation that happens in literature, we oftentimes can miss what is good, ultimately because of a perspective that an author had, or a view that an author had that maybe doesn't align up with our current society and culture. So when it comes to, so that's kind of like the broad, bigger deconstruction of what's going on in the United States and really around the world. But when it comes to faith, it's more specific. Maybe help us understand what that looks like in what we would call like faith deconstruction or the deconstructing of the faith, which is such a hot topic right now.
It is, and for me, we're obviously pastors, so we ruin a lot of movies for our families, probably because you and we watch a movie and we see the spiritual undercurrent of what's going
Yes.
on, and then if you're like me, you speak up, and the rest of the family's like, "Then we're done, turn it off," right? Like, Dad hates it, right? But for me, as I've seen deconstruction coming and kind of wrestling with its validity and is it good or bad, it really drew me back. Like 25 years ago, there was a movement called the Emerging Church, which was a group of young pastors who were gonna get church right and do it correctly, right? So,
Yeah.
and their heart was good, and their idea was, let's dismantle the things that are actually not propelling people forward in faith.
Yeah.
But what it devolved to was a bunch of young theologians sitting in rooms. Matter of fact, one of my pastor friends, is a group of really prominent theologians sitting in a room, and they had the conversation of, should we believe in hell anymore? And
Yeah.
his response was, hell yes, we should, because God believes in it, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
it was a non-issue for him, but they wanted to have a serious discussion amongst themselves of, does hell make Christian theology into the future?
Yeah.
So there's a parallel for me with that movement and what we see today, which it seems like it's pushing it to the individual now of a letting go of your faith.
Yeah, absolutely. Tyler Huckabee, the way that he defined the deconstruction of faith is a process of re-examining the faith that you grew up with. And I think that that's pretty true, that all of us at some point go through that process of reevaluating our faith, where it moves from our parents' faith to our faith. I think that the deconstruction can happen when we go through trial, right? And all of a sudden, this is what like, what do I do with the suffering that's going on in my life? I think deconstruction can happen when we've known one culture in society and how that culture in society views the Christian truths, and then all of a sudden you're pushed into a different culture, and it causes you to re-examine your faith. For me personally, that happened shortly after seminary. I graduated seminary early 2000s, and a book had just been written called Blue Like Jazz by Donald Miller.
Loved it.
And and I grew up in a pretty conservative house. I went to a conservative seminary, and I got out and I read Blue Like Jazz. I got out. I didn't get out. I graduated, and it was a really great experience for me, seminary in general. But I read Blue Like Jazz, and all of a sudden I was confronted with a guy who was a Democrat, who smoked, who had a few different views than I did, and yet was proclaiming Jesus as Savior of the world. And it really, that kind of coincided with me moving back to Colorado and wrestling with, like, what does Christianity look like? And it really kind of rocked me for, I would say, a couple of months of really wrestling with what my view of Christianity was versus maybe what God was opening my mind to. I think the issue of, when it comes to the deconstruction of the faith today, really the attempt is not just to deconstruct it in order to re-examine the faith that we grew up with, but to take it all the way down where there is no faith left.
Yes, and even for me, I mean, I'm a pretty simple guy, and like a baseball's one of my favorite sports, but it's kind of one of those things of, as you start reconstructing, I mean, there's a certain rules that they're adding to baseball, and they're tweaking it to speed the game up, and I get that. But if you said, hey, we're going to change this thing, when you hit the ball, instead of running to your right, you can run to your left now too, right?
Or
like,
up the middle.
Or up the middle. Now, and at some point, somebody has to say, that's no longer baseball. It might be an okay game, but it's no longer baseball. Like, it stepped out of bounds of something, and especially for something like faith, and for our congregation and for our kids, the scary thing is, in deconstructionism, it'd be easy for you to build a faith system that's actually no faith system at all. And for you to like it and to even build your life around it, but at the end of it, God says it's out of bounds. Like, it's no longer baseball. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
And that's a scary thing when it comes to something so foundational. And even the idea of, who am I and who are we to wade into the deconstruction process? So let me ask you. So, I mean, what's the difference between deconstruction and just honest questioning?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think that so I would say one of the two. Honest questioning, I think, happens with all of us, right? All of us have questions. We see, even in Scripture, one of Jesus' disciples, right, one of his 12 best buds, we call him Doubting Thomas, because he had all kinds of questions. And I think that when it comes to questions, God's not afraid of our questions. God actually invites our questions, and we don't have to look any further than the cross to realize that, where Jesus is hanging on the cross and he cries out to his Father, my God, why have you forsaken me? ? So I think that questions, ultimately, God's not afraid of them. We shouldn't be afraid to ask them. We shouldn't feel guilty for having questions and seasons in our lives where we're questioning, and trusting that ultimately, as we lean into the community, that answers will be found to those questions. I think that the danger in deconstructionism is that ultimately, as an individual, we go down the path that you just described, right? Where we tear apart at its very core faith. So, for example, because Paul didn't strictly speak out against slavery, but gave ways to live within the culture, that all of a sudden Paul is no longer worthy of our reading. I think of like the deconstruction, the danger of deconstruction was in what was called the Jesus movement, right? Where you had guys sitting around debating what parts of Jesus's life we should believe or not, based on, at times, a roll of a dice. And so it's like we're in this real world. Now, I think that, like, on the positive side of deconstructionism, I think what's happening, particularly around the movement of Christian nationalism and how tightly it's tied to our faith right now, and the deconstruction that's happening in younger generations, is not a bad thing. In fact, I think when we look to the scriptures, somebody who we all read in Paul walked through a deconstruction of his faith. Now, it wasn't Christianity, but it was Judaism, and what he thought about Judaism and the way that you were to live life and the way that you would make God happy was by maintaining all of the laws. And so the Pharisees put in all of these laws, right, to make sure that you didn't break God's laws. And so Paul was the best at it. And then he has this moment on the road to Damascus, and God opens his eyes, and for 3 days, the Bible tells us that he's sitting in the dark. And in those moments, he had to be questioning everything that he believed. Everything that he believed about God, everything that he believed about Jesus, everything that he understood from the Old Testament. And then when Ananias lays his hands on Paul, all of a sudden we're told that the scales fall off. And then what we don't realize, because, sometimes we don't understand timeline in Scripture, is that from about that point to the next time we really see Paul, which is in Acts 15, that's 15 years have passed, where Paul is reconstructing his faith. And so I don't want us to see deconstructionism as entirely bad. I think, like anything, there's good that can come out of it, and there's bad that can come out of it as well in that. And so I don't know if that answered your question completely, but that's the way I think through it. Yeah.
Well, and one of my fears and concerns is, like I question things, and I struggle, and I wrestle, and I have some throwdowns with God often, right? Where and he always reminds me, you're big, I'm bigger, right? Yeah. So it kind of usually ends there. But the heartbreaking thing for me, I mean, in the last 5 years, I probably have 6 to 10 friends who have walked away from the faith, and it's been a really interesting process, because it begins with them deconstructing, and then it becomes almost like salvation. Like, I'm free, I'm out, and I can live however I want. And this is their purpose is almost like to tell the rest of the world of this newfound freedom that they found. And then and for a lot of them, it's a bunch of weird podcasts that they start sending me, like, listen to this pastor, and it's like, he doesn't even open a Bible, It's like but the struggle that I have is, if you look at the trajectory, I mean, the first 6 to 8 months or a year, people are like, this is great, I'm free, I have Sundays back, I don't have to deny myself anything, right? Yeah. But if you look in the trajectory 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, the legacy in their families, those are the telltale things. I mean, it's kind of like if you quit working out tomorrow, you'd probably be like, this is great. Like, I don't have to get up so early. I can eat anything, right? But in 15 years, your life's going to look a lot different, and your kids are not going to see the pattern of your obedience in that. Yeah. Over the long haul. So I think it's easy for people to look at deconstructionism in a short window, yes, and call it success, instead of in the longevity and the fruit that it actually brings.
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, when it comes to deconstructionism, the bottom line is, what do we believe about Jesus, right? That always goes back to it. And in John 14:6, Jesus makes, the biggest statement of all time, that he is the way, right? That he's the truth, and that he's the light. And we have to wrestle with, what is that? Because either Jesus is a liar, right, and completely crazy, and has fooled the whole world, or he is who he says he is. And I think that for a lot of people, the problem is that we never get to that part, right? Your friends, the people who are deconstructing their faith, that I think, to answer your question earlier, questions ultimately lead to deconstruction. They can. And at some level, we always have to deal with Jesus. And so for people who are deconstructing their faith, oftentimes the conversations that they'll have with me is they'll go to like Jonah, and how could Jonah live in the belly of a well for 3 days? And I go, oh, that's your problem. Like, what do you do with the guy that died and rose again? Like, that's right. Like that's everything. Like, how many people have you known that have done that? Right. And so it's like, at the end of the day, I think that what we're seeing in the deconstructing of faith, particularly the in vogue side of things, is that people aren't dealing with Jesus. And when you honestly deal with Jesus, then you have to look at the Old Testament through the eyes of Jesus, that Jesus spoke about Jonah. So what do you do with that? If you believe that Jesus is who he says he is, then now how do you start to construct your faith around what Jesus believed about the Old Testament? And when we read the New Testament, despite the flaws and the failures of these men, which, newsflash, all of us are, but Jesus commissioned them to carry on the gospel to help us understand what it looks like. Like, he's the very commissioner of the New Testament. And so it's like Jesus believed in those guys and believed in what they were doing and what they would ultimately write as God. And so we have to look at that and go, okay, so ultimately in the deconstruction of our faith, what do we do with Jesus? And if we don't answer the Jesus question, then we're just being intellectually dishonest.
Yeah. And I think just realizing that living in tension is part of being human.
Yeah.
And it's part of every church and faith system. It's part of every marriage. It's part of every relationship with a dad and his son, right? I mean, tension is a reality, and
Yes.
how and where you go with that tension. I mean, yeah, and the scriptures are so clear on that. I mean, wrestle, but wrestle well with God. Don't and because it's not much of a fight if you kick God out of the ring, right? It's like, I won. It's like, well, not and really, I mean, Jesus, like you said, Paul, Martin Luther with the Reformation of the church. I mean, so many great theologians and people that we love, and even you and I. Like, there's a breaking down of systems and even some disciplines and expectations that just don't work in my life.
Yeah.
That I've had to let go of over the years, but I always take up something new that God draws me to in order to connect with him, because at the end of the day, that's my goal.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, I think both you and I can look back on history in our own lives and in the history of Christendom and even to the Bible and see that there were these moments where faith got deconstructed in good ways. You have Paul's example, right? We could look towards, oh my goodness, I'm spacing out the other one. Anyways, there's more examples in the scripture to what you just spoke to, and as we see that, we can see the positive sides of that. Where sometimes in Christian world, we get wrapped up in things that are not primary. We get wrapped up in the political system, and all of a sudden we find ourselves looking at our political leaders as our saviors. And it's Jesus plus at that point. That's probably something that needs to be deconstructed. So, one of the things as we kind of bring this to a close is I think that anytime that we have questions about the faith, anytime that we feel, or see or hear someone that enlightens our heart and is kind of on this deconstruction path, what I think I would encourage everybody is that it always happens within community, that God set us up in community. Proverbs 27, speaks of iron sharpening iron, and part of the deconstructing movement that is so disheartening to me is that our people are going down this path outside of community, right? They're doing it as an individual, and they're not allowing others to speak into their lives that ultimately can be life and hope. And so as we kind of wrap this up, any last words that you have?
Yeah, my biggest encouragement to our listeners is we at Crossroads want you to wrestle, because we believe that in wrestling will ultimately lead you to God. And if he's not able to step in the ring with you, then he's not a very good God and worthy of being followed and trusted. So we'd encourage you in this, and Crossroads is a safe place to do that. So if you're listening to this at the gym or on a drive, we'd encourage you, check out some of the content or services online. Come visit us. And if you'd like to sit across the table, you can buy us a beer or a cup of coffee, and we would love to have these conversations. This is what life is about, is wrestling well in community, and Crossroads is a great place to do that.
Yeah. Last thing I'd add for you, if you're looking to find those service times, you can go to crossroadsabc.com. If you have questions, any question, we're going to answer questions throughout this podcast. So you can send your questions to info@crossroadsabc.com and just put in the subject heading podcast. It'll find its way to James and I, and we will answer the question or make it up, one of those two, but it'll be good regardless. So anyways, thanks for joining us. Hopefully you're having a great day, and we'll catch you in a couple of weeks.
See ya.